May 10th, 1869. Two locomotives sit facing each other at Promontory Summit in Utah, their steel bodies gleaming under the mountain sun. Thousands of spectators crowd around, their eyes locked on history about to unfold. But here's what nobody in that crowd understood in that moment. They were watching the completion of not just a railroad, but the erasure of an entire way of life. This ceremony was supposed to be a celebration of American triumph. Instead, it would become the final nail in the coffin of Native American sovereignty. And behind the scenes, two men, Leland Stanford and Thomas C. Durant, were about to drive that spike not out of patriotism, but out of greed so consuming it would later destroy one of their legacies forever. By the end of today, you're going to understand that May 10th, 1869 wasn't about progress. It was about power. And we're about to tell you the truth nobody wants to admit. It started with a dream that seemed impossible. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act. The mission was simple but monumental: connect the east and west coasts of America by rail. For decades, people had talked about it. Railway engineers had dreamed about it. But nobody had actually done it. The distance was almost 1,800 miles of pure wilderness. Mountains that hadn't been conquered. Deserts that would kill you. Rivers with no bridges. And the government was willing to bet massive amounts of money and land to see it happen. Congress appointed two companies to build it. The Central Pacific Railroad, led by a group of Sacramento businessmen who called themselves the Big Four, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Charles Crocker, and Mark Hopkins, would build eastward from Sacramento, California. Meanwhile, the Union Pacific Railroad, controlled by Thomas C. Durant, a former doctor turned railroad baron, would build westward from Omaha, Nebraska. The two lines would race toward each other, competing mile by mile, building as fast as possible. The winner would claim the greatest engineering feat in American history. Or so they believed. Leland Stanford wasn't supposed to be a railroad tycoon. He was a merchant, a politician, someone who wanted power in California. When he joined the Central Pacific Project in 1862, he had never built a railroad before. None of the Big Four had. They were businessmen who saw an opportunity to become obscenely wealthy. Stanford believed that if he could connect California to the east, Sacramento would become the economic gateway to Asia. That vision drove him. That hunger for wealth and influence defined every decision he would make over the next 7 years. He would stop at nothing to win this race. Thomas C. Durant was a different kind of ambitious. He was a doctor who'd made millions during the Civil War supplying the army. He had tasted extreme wealth and wanted more. When he took control of the Union Pacific, he had one goal: make it the most profitable railroad project in human history. Unlike Stanford and the Big Four, who were political novices in railroad construction, Durant had experience. He'd built railroads before. He knew the business. He knew how to cut corners. He knew how to manipulate Congress, manipulate investors, and most importantly, how to steal money while making it look like legitimate business. This is where the story gets dark. The Central Pacific faced a problem that seemed unsolvable. They had to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains, one of the most treacherous mountain ranges in North America. To get over those mountains, they needed to climb 7,000 feet in elevation in less than 100 miles. That meant blasting through solid granite. It meant drilling tunnels through rock that hadn't been touched by man. It meant moving earth with nothing but hand tools, picks, shovels, and dynamite. Leland Stanford and Charles Crocker did something unprecedented. They looked at the available workforce and realized white laborers were refusing the job. It was too dangerous. The pay was too low. So they started recruiting Chinese immigrants. By 1865, Crocker brought in 50 Chinese workers to test if they could handle the work. They could. They didn't just keep up with white workers, they outworked them. They took on the most dangerous jobs without complaint. They worked through winters that dropped below freezing at night and then rose above 100 degrees during the day. By 1867, nearly 90% of the Central Pacific workforce was Chinese. Somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 Chinese men gave their labor to this project. But here's what Stanford and Crocker didn't advertise. These men were paid between $26 and $35 a month. They had to buy their own food. White workers made $35 a month with food provided. Chinese workers made less for more dangerous work. And thousands of them died. When the Central Pacific was building through the Sierra Nevada in 1867, workers faced conditions that would horrify modern people. Snow came early and stayed late. Avalanches were constant. Workers were sometimes suspended in baskets over cliffs, hanging hundreds of feet above the ground. Their job to plant explosive charges to blast through solid rock. If the rope broke, if the timing was wrong, if someone below miscalculated, they died. In one avalanche, 20 workers died instantly. Their bodies weren't discovered until the snow melted months later. Some were still holding their shovels. Construction supervisor James Strobridge wrote later that their camps were carried away by snowslides, and men were buried, and many of them were not found until the snow melted the next summer. Nobody kept accurate records of Chinese deaths. But historians estimate that at least 1 out of every 10 Chinese workers on the Sierra Nevada section died during construction. Some estimates go as high as 2,000 deaths. These men had families back in China. They had dreams of returning home with enough money to buy land or start a business. Instead, they were buried in unmarked graves in a foreign country, forgotten by history. The railroad companies acknowledged their importance privately. Leland Stanford himself told Congress that without Chinese workers, it would be impossible to complete the western portion of the railroad. But publicly, when the Golden Spike ceremony happened, when the photographs were taken, Chinese workers were nowhere to be seen. They'd done 90% of the work, and they received zero recognition. While Leland Stanford and Charles Crocker were driving Chinese workers to death in the Sierra Nevada, they were also getting very, very rich. Here's how. The government had offered both railroad companies subsidies. For every mile of track completed, the railroad would receive $16,000 to $48,000 in bonds and enormous amounts of land. The more track you laid, the more money you made. This created a perverse incentive. Companies didn't care about building quality railroads. They cared about building them fast to maximize government payments. Leland Stanford and the Big Four created a company called the Contract and Finance Company. Sounds legitimate, right? It wasn't. Here's the scheme. The Central Pacific would contract with itself through the Contract and Finance Company to build the railroad. The Central Pacific would charge itself inflated prices for construction, sometimes double or triple the actual costs. Then the Contract and Finance Company would pocket the massive difference. On paper, it looked like the Central Pacific was spending a fortune to build the railroad. In reality, Stanford and the Big Four were siphoning millions of dollars directly into their own pockets. Thomas C. Durant was doing something similar with the Union Pacific through a company called the Credit Mobilier of America. The setup was identical. The theft was massive. Historians estimate that nearly $44 million of the railroad's $94 million total budget was stolen through these corrupt schemes. The government knew it was happening. Congress knew it was happening. Nobody stopped it because everyone wanted the railroad finished. In June of 1867, something extraordinary happened. 3,000 Chinese workers, spread over more than 30 miles of track in the Sierra Nevada, organized a strike. This wasn't violent. It wasn't organized by American labor unions. It was organized by the workers themselves. They demanded higher wages. They demanded shorter hours. They demanded to be treated like humans instead of replaceable machines. For 8 days, the strike held. No work got done. No track was laid. The strike posed a threat to Leland Stanford's schedule. He had promised Congress the railroad would be completed by a certain deadline. The strike jeopardized everything. So Stanford did something that would define his response to any worker resistance for the rest of his life. He cut off all food provisions to the strikers. He starved them. After 8 days without food or supplies, the workers had no choice but to return. They got nothing. No wage increase. No shorter hours. No recognition of their rights. The strike simply disappeared from history. Most American history textbooks don't mention it. But it was the largest labor strike in United States history at that time. Thousands of workers, organized, disciplined, fighting for basic dignity. And they were crushed by a man who would later be remembered as a visionary philanthropist. Leland Stanford would become California's governor. He would found Stanford University. History would remember him as a great American. The Chinese workers who built his fortune, they would be erased. By early 1869, both railroads were closing in on each other. The Union Pacific, building across the relatively flat terrain of the Great Plains, had made faster progress. But the Central Pacific, having conquered the Sierra Nevada, was accelerating. The question was no longer whether they would meet. The question was where they would meet. Congress decided the meeting point would be Promontory Summit, north of the Great Salt Lake in Utah. But neither company was happy about this. Here's why. The government was still paying $32,000 per mile of track. So even after the official meeting point was chosen, both companies kept building past it. At one point, grading crews from both companies were literally working feet apart from each other, building parallel tracks in a race that had already been decided. It was wasteful. It was absurd. But it made sense to men like Leland Stanford and Thomas C. Durant. More track meant more government money. The race accelerated through the spring of 1869. Stanford's Central Pacific focused everything on reaching the meeting point. He pulled workers from other sections. He increased the pace. He drove his crews relentlessly. Meanwhile, Thomas Durant was dealing with his own crisis. The Credit Mobilier scandal was becoming public. Congress was investigating. His empire was crumbling. He was desperate for the railroad to be completed on his schedule, in his way, with him as a central figure. But fate had other plans. As May 10, 1869 approached, Leland Stanford made a strategic decision. He would be there to drive the final spike. He would be the face of this achievement. He invited politicians, journalists, dignitaries from across America. He wanted the world to watch as he connected the two coasts. A golden spike was specially made, gold-plated, heavy, engraved with the names of railroad officers and the dates of construction. It was meant to be symbolic, a monument to American progress. Thomas C. Durant was supposed to be there too. Both men were supposed to drive the final spike together, a symbol of unity between East and West. But on May 8th, things fell apart for Durant. As his train headed west from New York toward Utah, angry railroad workers in Wyoming stopped it. These men were owed $200,000 in back wages. They'd built railroad ties, done the most brutal labor, and received nothing. They held Durant hostage until Oliver Ames, another Union Pacific official, paid them $50,000 in compensation. But that wasn't the end of Durant's problems. His train reached Echo Canyon in Utah only to find a washed-out bridge. It would take until early morning on May 10th to repair it. Durant wouldn't arrive until the ceremony was already beginning. This delay would shape how history remembered him. When he finally arrived, exhausted and sick with what some said was a hangover from heavy drinking the night before, the moment had already passed. Stanford was about to drive the spike. At 12:47 in the afternoon on May 10th, 1869, Leland Stanford stepped forward with the golden spike and a silver hammer. Thousands of spectators watched. Photographers captured the moment. Telegraphers stood ready to send a single word to the entire nation: done. Stanford raised the hammer. He swung. The hammer missed the spike. He struck the railroad tie instead. The crowd was stunned. The greatest moment of his life, and he'd fumbled it. A telegraph operator, watching from his station, was supposed to wait for the successful drive to send the message. But something extraordinary happened. Even though Stanford had missed, the telegraph operator sent the signal anyway. Done. The word went out to the nation. Church bells rang in San Francisco. Cannons fired in New York. Celebrations erupted from coast to coast. Thomas C. Durant, watching from the crowd, stepped forward for his turn. He too was supposed to drive a spike. But accounts from the ceremony say he was suffering from a severe headache. Some observers noted his hands were shaking. He swung. He missed too. Neither of the two men who controlled the railroad actually drove the final spike successfully. Instead, it was a railroad worker, nameless, unrecorded, who picked up the hammer and drove the real spike home. The symbolism was lost on everyone at that moment. The ceremony that was supposed to celebrate the vision of two powerful men was completed by someone whose name nobody recorded. The man who truly connected America remained invisible. Just like the thousands of Chinese workers who had done most of the physical labor. Just like the Irish and immigrant workers who'd risked their lives on the Union Pacific. History belonged to Stanford and Durant. As America celebrated on May 10th, 1869, as newspapers proclaimed the greatest engineering triumph in human history, something darker was unfolding that the celebrations completely ignored. This railroad didn't just connect America. It enabled the systematic destruction of Native American nations. The Platte River Valley, which the railroad followed, had been home to tribes for generations. The railroad brought disease. It brought settlers. It brought soldiers. It enabled westward expansion at an unprecedented scale. The buffalo herds that sustained Plains tribes were hunted to near extinction to feed railroad workers. Tribes were forced onto reservations. Their lands were stolen. Their way of life was extinguished. The railroad also brought a wave of anti-Chinese violence that Americans tried to forget about. The same Chinese workers who had been essential to building the railroad were suddenly unwanted. Anti-Chinese riots erupted in California and Nevada. Chinese workers were attacked, murdered, driven out of towns. The government that had subsidized their employment through railroad construction passed the Chinese Exclusion Act a little over a decade later, making it illegal for Chinese people to immigrate to America. The workers who had literally built the nation with their hands and sacrifice were told they didn't belong. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Thomas C. Durant's empire collapsed. The credit mobilier scandal consumed his reputation. Congress investigated. While he escaped direct legal punishment, he never recovered the power he'd once wielded. He faded from history, remembered as corrupt and ruthless. He died in 1885, broken, watching younger men profit from the railroad he'd built through fraud. Leland Stanford went the opposite direction. He became California's governor. He became a U.S. senator. He used his fortune to establish Stanford University, one of the greatest institutions in America. His corruption was overlooked. His exploitation was forgotten. History remembered him as a visionary, a philanthropist, a builder of empires. The Chinese workers who'd died in avalanches, frozen in the snow? Nobody remembered them. The wage slaves who'd been underpaid and overworked? Nobody gave them statues or named universities after them. The railroad succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. Within a decade, it transformed America. Trade boomed. Western cities exploded in population. Native American nations were destroyed. Land was stolen at an unprecedented rate. Wealth accumulated in the hands of railroad barons. The railroad that was supposed to unite America did unite it economically. But it did so on the backs of the most vulnerable people in the country. Chinese workers, Irish immigrants, Native Americans. They paid the price for American progress. Leland Stanford and Thomas C. Durant got rich. They got powerful. One of them even got immortality through the university that bears his name. And that, in the end, is the real story of May 10th, 1869. Not a triumph of engineering, not a celebration of American vision, but a lesson about whose sacrifice gets remembered and whose gets forgotten. When history books tell the story of the Transcontinental Railroad, they talk about the Golden Spike. They show photographs of locomotive engines meeting face to face. They celebrate the engineering achievement. They talk about how this railroad reduced travel time from 6 months to 2 weeks. They talk about how it opened up the frontier. They talk about American progress and manifest destiny. But they don't talk about the 1,000 Chinese workers who died in the Sierra Nevada. They don't talk about the 3,000 workers who struck for basic dignity and were starved into submission. They don't talk about the billions of dollars in Native American land that was stolen to build this railroad. They don't talk about the government corruption, the embezzled funds, the stolen wages. They certainly don't talk about how Leland Stanford, founder of one of America's greatest universities, stood against Chinese immigration while using Chinese labor to build his fortune. The Transcontinental Railroad was both a triumph and a tragedy. It was an engineering marvel built on human suffering. It was a symbol of progress that enabled the erasure of entire peoples. It was the work of thousands of nameless laborers who built it and got nothing while a handful of wealthy men got everything. This is the story that doesn't make it into the history books. This is the truth that gets glossed over in celebrations of American achievement. The railroad is still being used today. Millions of people have ridden it. But almost nobody knows the real price that was paid to build it. Almost nobody knows the names of the men who died. Almost nobody knows about the strike that was crushed, the workers who were exploited, the theft that was sanctioned by the government. So what do you think? When you look at the Transcontinental Railroad now, do you see a triumph of engineering? Or do you see a monument to American greed? Do you see progress? Or do you see conquest dressed up as advancement? The truth is, it's all of those things at the same time. History is complicated. Achievement is complicated. America's greatest moments often came at someone else's expense. This railroad connected a continent, but it disconnected people from their land, their culture, their lives. It enriched a few while impoverishing many. And the men who drove that golden spike? They're remembered as heroes. The workers who actually built it? Most are forgotten. That's the real story of May 10th, 1869. That's the Transcontinental Railroad nobody talks about. What do you think? Was this progress or conquest? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories about history that challenge what we think we know, subscribe now. We've got more narratives coming that will change how you see America. Thanks for watching.